Hey guys, so we've done a notes video giving some background on the civil rights movement and a recap up to this point. So in this notes video, I'm going to be talking about different important events and people from the 1940s and 50s civil rights movements. So to begin with, we need to start with President Truman, as he is the first president to integrate the armed forces. So in 1940, Roosevelt gave an announcement saying that they would begin training Black pilots for the military. So prior to this point, African Americans had participated as soldiers in every war that we had ever fought in America. However, although they wanted to participate as airmen in World War I, they were rejected as people thought that Black men were not competent enough to fly an airplane. So Roosevelt changes that with the Tuskegee Airmen. They become a primarily African American group of soldiers, Air Force people who are being trained to fly planes. So the Tuskegee Airmen, mainly Black men, but also some people who are Hispanic, other minorities are also integrated into the Tuskegee Airmen. Also, Truman in 1946 appoints a committee to study race relations in the United States. And they are responsible for proposing measures to strengthen and safeguard civil rights in the United States. So basically, they're responsible for looking for the problems and trying to come up with solutions to fix them. So they conducted inquiries, examined existing laws in place, regulations, statutes in different states and across federal government. And they also made recommendations for policy improvements in order to more integrate Black people into the society. And then also in 1948, Truman ends segregation in the armed forces. He feels like this will, bring the country closer together. He feels as though the African Americans deserve to be integrated since they have served in the military so loyally for so many years. Another thing that's happening during World War II is the Double V campaign. So World War II is happening in Europe. We get involved pretty late, but that's America for you. But the Black newspaper in Philadelphia launches what they call a Double V campaign. So they are campaigning not only for victory over enemies abroad, the Nazis during World War II, but also an end to racial discrimination at home, especially since there are so many soldiers who are Black serving in the military. And at that point, so World War II ends in 1945. Truman doesn't end segregation in the armed forces until 1948. So at this point, while World War II is happening, Black soldiers are still being discriminated against and kept separate from white soldiers. So ending racial discrimination as well as victory over the Nazis. Moving into the 1950s civil rights movement. So we have Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a super important legislation that is passed down by the Supreme Court. This is probably the most significant piece of civil rights legislation that is passed in the entirety of the civil rights movement throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So the Supreme Court decides in 1954, the Brown versus the Board of Education, and basically they reverse the decision from the 1896 case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that states separate but equal is legal. So basically the Brown versus Board of Education court case says that separate but equal is wrong. And that separate facilities are inherently unequal. So Brown versus Board of Education ends separate but equal and tells people to start integration. So this case is basically the end of the South's Jim Crow era. We also have the Montgomery bus boycott during the 1950s. So in December of 1955, I'm sure you guys all know the story. Rosa Parks is tired from working all day and refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. So she is arrested and charged with violating segregation laws, even though she was sitting in the black section. It was just a crowded bus. So the civil rights leaders who are present in Montgomery organized the bus boycott because Rosa Parks is a prominent member in society in the Black community in Alabama. So she's very well respected, and they feel like she will represent them well as a figurehead for the movement. They feel like a lot of people will rally behind her. She has lots of connections in the area. Um, so this is really the first nonviolent protest that Martin Luther King gets involved in. And he calls on Montgomery's Black population to not ride the bus. So they want to boycott buses for the next year. So over the next year, they get 50,000 mainly Black people in the area to find other methods of transportation. So for a full year, they organize carpools, they get bikes for people who need them, things like that. People walk miles to get to work. And this boycott gains national attention. And eventually, since the buses do mainly rely on the Black people for, paying for public transportation, they eventually give in. And the Supreme Court also rules that segregating buses is unconstitutional. So, super important event. Another one is the Little Rock Nine, who I'm sure you guys have also heard of before. But this is a group of students in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. So even though we have passed Brown versus the Board of Education, separate but equal in 1954, it takes a while for them to actually enact that in schools across the country. So in 1957, 3 years after that Brown versus Board of Education case, they start to try and integrate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. But Governor Orval Faubus, a very strange name, he claims that he can't keep orders in schools if he's forced to integrate them. So he brings in the state National Guard troops to turn away the 9 Black students who are supposed to be attending high school now at the the historically white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. So the federal government ends up having to get involved, and Eisenhower has to order the troops to protect these 9 students who are coming in and attending school in Little Rock. SCLC is a big group during this time period, and they're active, throughout the 60s as well. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is a group that was organized by Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. And Martin Luther King serves as the president of this organization for much of the 1950s and 60s. So basically, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference wants to figure out ways to coordinate and control protesters so that they are only using nonviolent protest in order to keep the movement at the forefront of national focus. So they only want to use nonviolent protest because they feel as though if they use violent protest, people will use that against them and they'll never end up getting what they want out of these protests, which is equality, freedom for African Americans. And then here we have a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. His whole stance is based around nonviolent protest. So he says, nonviolent resistance transforms weakness into strength and breeds courage in the face of danger. And he maintains this view throughout the 50s and 60s until his assassination in the 60s. And next time, we will hop into talking about the 1960s civil rights movement.